September 7th, 1822. The banks of the Ipiranga River outside Sao Paulo. A 24-year-old prince receives a letter that will change two continents forever. As he reads Portugal's ultimatum, return immediately or face treason charges, his face darkens with rage. In a moment that will echo through history, Pedro de Alcântara rips the Portuguese insignia from his uniform, draws his sword toward the sky, and screams words that birth a nation: independence or death. But this mythic moment, frozen in countless paintings and monuments, tells us almost nothing about the man who made it. Who was this Pedro of Braganza, who could destroy an empire with a single gesture? History remembers the declaration, but has largely forgotten the declarer. A figure so contradictory, so impossibly human, that he defies every attempt to reduce him to heroic marble. Pedro lived a life of operatic extremes that would exhaust a dozen ordinary men. Emperor of Brazil at 24, King of Portugal at 36, he conquered hearts and capitals with equal passion. He composed haunting folk songs and signed death warrants, bedded merchants' daughters and married Austrian archduchesses, championed liberty while maintaining slavery, preached constitutionalism while ruling as autocrat. His reign lasted less than a decade, yet he transformed the very meaning of monarchy in the New World. The man who emerged from exile to become South America's only emperor was forged in contradictions that would define his empire. Born European but raised American, royal by blood but revolutionary by conviction, he embodied the impossible tensions of his age. His story reveals how the boy who learned guitar from palace servants became the prince who chose his adopted homeland over his ancestral throne. This is the story of a king too passionate for his own crown, whose greatest triumph, Brazilian independence, came at the cost of everything he was born to inherit. Today, we unmask the emperor who proved that sometimes the most important revolutions begin not in the streets, but in the human heart. In the waning years of the 18th century, Europe trembled under the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte. The old order, built on divine right, aristocratic privilege, and centuries-old dynasties, faced its greatest challenge since the Reformation. Portugal, once master of the seas and architect of global trade routes, found itself caught in a web of impossible choices. The nation that had given the world Vasco da Gama and dominated the spice trade now struggled to maintain relevance in an age of revolutionary fervor and imperial ambition. The House of Braganza, which had ruled Portugal since 1640, embodied both the grandeur and decay of the Ancien regime. Queen Maria I, known as Maria the Mad, had retreated into religious mania and melancholy after losing multiple children to smallpox. Her son, the future João VI, governed as regent, a well-meaning but indecisive man torn between his mother's piety and the brutal pragmatism demanded by the times. His Spanish wife, Carlota Joaquina of Bourbon, brought to the marriage not only royal blood, but also the scheming ambition of her family line, forever plotting to expand Spanish influence through Portuguese weakness. Into this world of fading empire and looming catastrophe, Pedro de Alcântara was born on October 12, 1798, at Caylus Palace. He entered life as the third son, behind his brothers Antonio and Francisco, a position that would paradoxically grant him the freedom to develop outside the suffocating protocols of heir apparent while simultaneously leaving him hungry for significance. The scent of orange blossoms that filled Queulu's gardens would forever remind him of childhood summers spent in a gilded cage. Watching his parents' marriage dissolve into mutual contempt and political maneuvering. Young Pedro's early years unfolded against the backdrop of his parents' disastrous union. João VI, though kind-hearted, possessed neither the steel nor the vision to match his wife's Machiavellian instincts. Carlota Joaquina, raised in the Spanish court's tradition of ruthless statecraft, viewed her husband's gentleness as weakness and her adopted country as a mere stepping stone to greater power. She conducted clandestine correspondence with foreign courts, always seeking advantage, always plotting her next move in the great game of European politics. While his older brothers received formal education in statecraft and military science, Pedro found himself drawn to the palace's margins. The kitchens where Mozarabic cooks prepared exotic dishes, the stables where Andalusian grooms taught him to ride, the servants' quarters where forbidden songs floated through the evening air. When Carlota discovered her son learning guitar from a cook or dancing fandangos with stable boys, her fury was swift and brutal. Braganza's rule animals, they don't sing with them, she would hiss, dragging him away by the ear. Yet these experiences, meant as punishments, became Pedro's education in humanity. He learned that power without empathy created monsters, that nobility of spirit mattered more than nobility of blood. The famous incident of the carved guitar in his bedpost, a silent act of rebellion against his mother's attempts to suppress his musical nature, reveals the emergence of a personality that would define his later reign. Even as a child, Pedro refused to be broken by authority he considered unjust. This same spirit would later drive him to challenge not only his parents, but the entire colonial system that had created their wealth. By 1807, Napoleon's continental system had transformed Europe into an economic battlefield. The French emperor's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Strangle British trade by closing every European port to English goods. For Portugal, this presented an impossible dilemma. The nation's economy depended heavily on trade with Britain, its oldest ally. Yet defying Napoleon meant facing the Grande Armée that had crushed Austria, Prussia, and countless other opponents. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed between France and Spain in October 1807, sealed Portugal's fate. Napoleon and his Spanish allies planned to partition the country, with the northern regions going to Spain and the south becoming a French satellite state. When news of this treachery reached Lisbon, panic gripped the court. João VI faced three impossible choices: submit to Napoleon and betray Britain, resist and face certain destruction, or flee to Brazil and abandon his European kingdom. The decision to flee, suggested by British Admiral Sidney Smith and supported by the court's more pragmatic voices, represented both cowardice and wisdom. Portugal could not defend itself against Napoleon's armies, but the royal family's presence in Brazil might preserve the monarchy and the empire's unity. Yet this choice came with a terrible price: the abandonment of the Portuguese people to French occupation and the transformation of colony into the seat of imperial power. 9-year-old Pedro witnessed these debates with the sharp eyes of a child who had learned to read adult emotions through years of navigating his parents' toxic relationship. When he overheard his mother's secret correspondence with Napoleon, offering Portugal's fleet in exchange for Spanish territorial concessions. He confronted her with a courage that shocked even Carlotta. Her punishment was swift. 3 days locked in the Sala das Pegas, the magpie room, surrounded by painted birds that seemed to mock his helplessness. During those 3 days, as refugees flooded Lisbon's streets and foreign armies approached, Pedro experienced his first taste of political imprisonment. The lesson burned deep. Power corrupts not through sudden transformation, but through small compromises that accumulate like poison in the soul. The evacuation of the Portuguese court ranks among history's most extraordinary royal flights. In a single night, 15,000 people, nobles, servants, clergy, bureaucrats, and hangers-on, boarded 40 ships carrying not just human cargo, but the entire apparatus of imperial government. They took the royal treasury, the crown jewels, libraries containing 60,000 volumes, art collections, religious relics, and even the printing press. This wasn't merely escape. It was the physical relocation of an empire. The scene at the Tagus River docks bordered on chaos. Families were separated in the confusion. Servants abandoned their masters or were abandoned by them. And the line between salvation and damnation often came down to money, connections, or sheer luck. The Marquis de Alorna's suicide, choosing death over abandonment, provided a gruesome punctuation mark to the night's drama. Pedro, clutching his copy of Don Quixote, a book that would influence his romantic idealism throughout his life, watched the man's body float in the sewage-brown water and learned that honor sometimes demands the ultimate sacrifice. But even in escape, Portugal could not escape the web of great power politics. Admiral Sidney Smith's last-minute demand for commercial concessions, threatening to block the fleet's departure unless João VI signed treaties favorable to British trade, revealed the true nature of international friendship. Britain would protect Portugal, but at a price that would make Brazil little more than an informal British colony. Pedro, though young, understood the bitter irony. They were fleeing one form of servitude only to embrace another. The 52-day Atlantic crossing transformed the Portuguese court from European aristocrats into desperate refugees. The ships, overcrowded and undersupplied, became floating prisons where class distinctions dissolved in the face of shared suffering. Storms battered the fleet, dysentery spread through the lower decks, and the thin veneer of civilization cracked under pressure. Pedro shared quarters with Father Antonio, his elderly tutor, who used his final days to impart crucial lessons about leadership and sacrifice. "Remember," the dying priest gasped, "a king is servant first." This wisdom, delivered in the stench of a plagued ship, would resonate throughout Pedro's later struggles with the meaning of royal authority. When Father Antonio died on Christmas Eve and was unceremoniously dumped overboard without proper rites, Pedro composed his first Modinha, a haunting folk ballad that captured the existential loneliness of exile. Marsem fam, terra sem mim, endless sea, land without me. This musical composition marks a crucial moment in Pedro's development. Music became his way of processing trauma, of finding beauty in suffering, of connecting with emotions that royal protocol demanded he suppress. The spare heir, freed from the expectations that constrained his older brothers, found his authentic voice in the darkness of the ship's hold. The fleet's arrival in Salvador de Bahia on January 22nd 1808 marked the beginning of Pedro's education in the brutal realities of colonial exploitation. His first steps on Brazilian soil brought him face to face with a chained Yoruba prince being auctioned in the slave market. The locked gaze between the two princes, one born to rule, the other condemned to serve, crystallized the moral contradictions that would torment Pedro throughout his life. Colonial Brazil operated on a foundation of enslaved labor that made Portuguese wealth possible. The sugar plantations, gold mines, and coffee fazendas that generated imperial revenue depended on the systematic dehumanization of millions of Africans. Yet Pedro's wandering through Salvador's backstreets, his encounter with Quilombola communities, and his sharing of acreage with an African elder who told him, "You carry chains too, little prince," began a process of moral awakening that would eventually lead him to question the entire colonial system. The fleet's arrival in Salvador de Bahia on January 22nd, 1808, marked the beginning of Pedro's education in the brutal realities of colonial exploitation. His first steps on Brazilian soil brought him face to face with a chained Yoruba prince being auctioned in the slave market. The locked gaze between the two princes, one born to rule, the other condemned to serve, crystallized the moral contradictions that would torment Pedro throughout his life. Colonial Brazil operated on a foundation of enslaved labor that made Portuguese wealth possible. The sugar plantations, gold mines, and coffee fazendas that generated imperial revenue depended on the systematic dehumanization of millions of Africans. Yet Pedro's wandering through Salvador's backstreets, his encounter with Quilombola communities, and his sharing of acreage with an African elder who told him, "You carry chains too, little prince," began a process of moral awakening that would eventually lead him to question the entire colonial system. By age 14, Pedro had mastered the art of living dual lives. During daylight hours, he performed the role of dutiful prince, attending Latin lessons, practicing courtly manners, receiving foreign dignitaries with appropriate gravitas. But after sunset, he transformed into something far more dangerous. A young man racing mules through Santa Teresa's hills, gambling in working-class taverns, and forming friendships with poets and revolutionaries who dreamed of Brazilian independence. The confrontation with his mother's guards in a Rio favela marks Pedro's emergence as a figure capable of violence in defense of his principles. Drawing a sailor's knife and declaring, "Tell the queen her hunting dog bites back," represented more than adolescent rebellion. It was a declaration of war against the system that had created him. The blade that slashed his arm left a scar he would carry for life, a permanent reminder of the price of resistance. Carlotta's reaction to finding her son stitching his own wound, her chilling laugh, and the observation, "Finally, some steel in you. Pity it's wasted on trash," revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of her son's character. She saw his defiance as mere willfulness that could be redirected toward her own purposes. She failed to recognize that Pedro's rebellion was principled, not personal, and that his sympathy for the trash she despised would eventually drive him to champion their cause against the very system that had elevated his family to power. The blood that soaked Pedro's lace cuff that morning symbolized the death of the spare heir and the birth of something far more dangerous. A prince who had learned to see empire from the bottom up, who understood that legitimacy came not from birth but from service, and who possessed both the courage and the cruelty necessary to reshape the world according to his vision. As this chapter closes, we see Pedro poised on the threshold of manhood, his character forged in the crucible of exile, colonial exploitation, and family betrayal. The boy who had once carved a guitar into his bedpost had become a young man capable of carving new nations from the ruins of old empires. Yet this was only the beginning. The true test would come as he matured in Brazil's tropical heat, where the freedoms he had discovered as a child would transform into dangerous political convictions. With Napoleon's defeat in 1814, Europe began pressuring the Portuguese court to return to Lisbon and restore the old colonial order. The idea that Brazil, now the de facto center of the Portuguese Empire, should once again become a mere colony struck Pedro as not just insulting but impossible. He had grown up watching Brazil's transformation from imperial backwater to the beating heart of Portuguese power. The merchants, planters, and intellectuals who now surrounded the court in Rio were no longer content to be treated as colonial subjects. Pedro's own transformation accelerated during these years, racing horses through Rio's hills, composing modinhas that captured the soul of his adopted homeland, and forming romantic attachments that scandalized the European-born court. He was becoming more Brazilian than Portuguese. His mother's disgust at these developments only deepened his resolve. Their legendary confrontations, including the moment he drew his sword on her guards, marked the final break between the prince who might have been and the revolutionary he was becoming. When Portuguese liberals finally forced the royal family's hand in 1820, demanding their return and Brazil's reduction to colonial status, they lit a fuse that would explode across two continents. Pedro's response was swift and uncompromising. If Portugal tries to reduce us, we'll make ourselves independent. The spare heir had become something his creators never intended. A prince willing to destroy an empire to save a nation. Rio de Janeiro's tropical heat accomplished what years of European court protocol could not. It liberated Pedro de Alcântara from the suffocating expectations of royal birth. The boy who had carved guitars into bedposts at Calu's palace found in Brazil's sensual climate and mixed society the freedom to discover who he truly was beneath the ceremonial uniforms and practiced courtesies. Here, in a city where African rhythms mixed with Portuguese fados and indigenous melodies, where the scent of jacaranda blossoms competed with the salt spray of Guanabara Bay, Pedro underwent a transformation that would reshape the destiny of two continents. The timid prince who had cowered before his mother's rages vanished like morning mist. In his place emerged a young man of almost frightening vitality, racing thoroughbred horses through Santa Teresa's winding streets at dawn, his laughter echoing off colonial facades still damp with tropical dew. These weren't the careful rides of European aristocracy, supervised by grooms and confined to palace grounds. Pedro rode like a carioca, weaving through narrow alleys where freed slaves sold acai and Portuguese merchants hawked textiles, his mount's hooves striking sparks from cobblestones laid by convict labor decades earlier. Music became his obsession and his rebellion, while his tutors drilled him in Latin conjugations and his confessor lectured about royal dignity. Pedro escaped to Rio's taverns, where he learned to play guitar with a passion that bordered on the religious. His modinhas, those haunting folk ballads that captured the soul of colonial Brazil, weren't the polite compositions expected of a prince, but raw expressions of longing, love, and loss that spoke to experiences far removed from palace walls. When he sang of unrequited love or the beauty of Brazilian sunsets, he channeled emotions that no European court would have permitted him to acknowledge, much less express. His romantic adventures scandalized the Portuguese nobility, but endeared him to Rio's merchant classes. Pedro's affairs with the daughters of shopkeepers, plantation overseers, and minor bureaucrats weren't mere princely dalliances, but genuine relationships that taught him about Brazil from perspectives no royal education could provide. These women introduced him to a society where racial boundaries were more fluid than in Europe, where Portuguese, African, and indigenous cultures had created something entirely new. Through their eyes, he began to see Brazil not as a colonial appendage, but as a nation with its own identity, its own dreams, its own destiny. Carlota Joaquina watched her son's transformation with horror that gradually curdled into homicidal rage. The prince she had molded through cruelty and manipulation was slipping from her control, adopting the customs and sympathies of people she considered barely human. Her Spanish pride, already wounded by exile to what she saw as a tropical backwater, could not tolerate her son's embrace of Brazilian culture. "You disgrace us," she would shriek during their increasingly violent confrontations, her voice carrying through the Paco Imperial's corridors like the cry of some exotic bird of prey. Their clashes became the stuff of court legend, whispered about in drawing rooms from Rio to Salvador. The most infamous occurred in 1817, when Pedro returned from a 3-day absence reeking of cachaca and singing a modinha he'd learned from dock workers. Carlota's rage exploded in a torrent of Spanish curses that would have made a conquistador blush. When her guards moved to physically restrain Pedro, he drew his sword with a speed that stunned everyone present. The blade's point hovered inches from a guard's throat as Pedro's voice dropped to a whisper more terrifying than any shout. "Touch me again, and I'll send you to explain yourselves to God." This wasn't teenage rebellion, but political revolution in miniature. Pedro had discovered something more powerful than royal blood. The love of people who saw him not as their ruler, but as their champion. The Brazilians who cheered his horse races, who taught him their songs, who welcomed him into their beds and their hearts, offered something Carlota's European machinations never could: authentic loyalty based on shared affection rather than calculated advantage. The Queen's attempts to reassert control only deepened Pedro's rebellion. She arranged formal meetings with Portuguese generals, hoping to remind him of his European obligations. Pedro would arrive deliberately late, dressed in clothes that mixed royal Portuguese blue with Brazilian yellow, his manner politely insolent. When General Beresford lectured him about the importance of maintaining Portuguese authority in Brazil, Pedro smiled and asked whether the general had tried feijoada, then launched into an enthusiastic description of African cooking techniques that left the military man sputtering with confusion. The revolution that erupted in Porto on August 24th, 1820, sent shockwaves through the Portuguese Empire that would ultimately shatter it forever. Portuguese liberals, inspired by the Spanish constitutional movement and frustrated by 13 years of British-protected royal absence, demanded the immediate return of King João VI and the restoration of Portugal as the empire's center. Their grievances were real and deep. Brazil had become the tail wagging the Portuguese dog. its economic interests now driving imperial policy, while Portugal itself suffered under British commercial domination. The revolution's leaders made demands that revealed how completely they misunderstood the transformation that exile had wrought. They wanted not just the royal family's return, but Brazil's reduction to its pre-1808 colonial status, the closing of Brazilian ports to direct foreign trade, the dismantling of the ministries and court apparatus that had made Rio an imperial capital, and the subordination of Brazilian interests to Portuguese commercial needs. To men who had never experienced Brazil's vastness or potential, these seemed reasonable adjustments. To Pedro, who had come to see himself as more Brazilian than Portuguese, they represented nothing less than the strangulation of his adopted homeland. The arrival of news from Porto in October 1820 found Pedro in the midst of a weeks-long celebration of Brazilian culture that would have been impossible in any European court. He had spent the month attending festivals where enslaved Africans danced alongside Portuguese merchants, where indigenous communities shared traditional foods with recent European immigrants, where the complex racial hierarchies of colonial society temporarily dissolved in shared revelry. The contrast between this vibrant, creative chaos and the rigid constitutionalism of the Portuguese liberals could not have been starker. João Vi's response to the revolution revealed the weakness that had always characterized his reign. Rather than make a decisive choice, he attempted to satisfy everyone by satisfying no one. He would return to Portugal, he announced, but only after establishing institutions that would preserve Brazil's enhanced status within the empire. He would accept constitutional limits on royal power, but insisted on maintaining the prerogatives necessary for effective government. He would respect Portuguese commercial interests, but not at the expense of Brazilian development. This attempted compromise pleased nobody and convinced Pedro that his father lacked the vision necessary to navigate the crisis engulfing their family. The Portuguese liberals saw João's conditions as foot-dragging designed to preserve Brazilian privileges at Portugal's expense. Brazilian merchants and planters, meanwhile, began to whisper that only complete independence could protect their interests from Portuguese revenge. Pedro found himself caught between these irrepressible forces, his dual loyalties becoming impossible to maintain. The months following the Porto Revolution marked Pedro's transformation from cultural rebel to political revolutionary. His nocturnal wanderings through Rio's streets now carried him into meetings where Brazilian-born intellectuals discussed ideas that would have been treasonous to voice openly. The possibility of independence, the creation of a Brazilian monarchy separate from Portugal, the establishment of institutions that would serve Brazilian rather than European interests. These conversations revealed to Pedro the intellectual framework that could justify what his heart already knew, that Brazil had outgrown colonialism and deserved to take its place among the world's independent nations. The men who gathered in Rio's coffee houses and private libraries weren't wild-eyed revolutionaries, but educated professionals. Lawyers who had studied at Coimbra, priests trained in canon law, merchants whose businesses spanned continents. Their arguments combined Enlightenment political theory with practical observations about Brazil's unique circumstances. José Bonifácio de Andrada e Silva, the mineralogist who would become known as the Patriarch of Independence, proved particularly influential in shaping Pedro's political education. a man of encyclopedic learning who had spent decades in European universities before returning to Brazil. José Bonifacio possessed the intellectual authority to make independence seem not just possible, but inevitable. His vision of a constitutional monarchy that would preserve order while expanding liberty appealed to Pedro's desire for dramatic change without social chaos. The prince's growing political sophistication manifested in his increasingly bold public statements. When Portuguese officials complained about his Brazilian sympathies, he responded with carefully crafted defenses of colonial rights that skirted the edge of sedition without crossing into open rebellion. His speeches to Rio's municipal councils began incorporating language about the need to respect Brazilian peculiarities and legitimate interests, code words that his audiences understood as stepping stones toward independence. Pedro's romantic life during this period also took on political dimensions. His relationship with Domitila de Castro, the woman who would later become the Marchioness of Santos, began as a passionate affair, but evolved into something resembling a political alliance. Domitila, though married to an army officer, possessed an intelligence and ambition that complemented Pedro's own. She understood Brazilian society in ways that his European-born advisors could not, and her insights into the aspirations of Brazil's emerging middle classes proved invaluable as Pedro navigated the treacherous waters of colonial politics. The arrival of Portuguese troops in Rio in February 1821, sent by the Lisbon government to ensure royal compliance with revolutionary demands, marked the beginning of the end for the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. These soldiers, commanded by officers who made no secret of their contempt for Brazilian pretensions, represented everything Pedro had come to despise about Portuguese attitudes toward his adopted homeland. The troops' behavior in Rio confirmed Brazilian fears about Portuguese intentions. They quartered themselves in private homes without permission, requisitioned supplies without payment, and treated Brazilian-born citizens with casual arrogance that would have been unthinkable in dealing with Europeans. When a Portuguese sergeant struck a Brazilian merchant who refused to hand over his goods without proper authorization, the incident sparked riots that revealed the depth of anti-Portuguese sentiments simmering beneath Rio's surface calm. Pedro's response to these provocations marked his final break with Portuguese authority. Rather than support the troops his father had been ordered to accept, he publicly condemned their excesses and demanded that Portuguese officers respect Brazilian law and custom. This wasn't mere diplomatic language, but a direct challenge to the chain of command that linked Rio to Lisbon. By defending Brazilian rights against Portuguese authority, Pedro was effectively declaring his independence from the very system that had created his power. The crisis deepened when João VI announced his intention to depart for Portugal in April 1821, leaving Pedro as regent with severely limited authority. The Portuguese revolutionaries had made clear that they considered the prince's Brazilian sympathies a threat to their goals, and they intended to recall him to Lisbon as soon as his father's position was secure. This prospect of being dragged back to Europe just as Brazil stood on the threshold of greatness filled Pedro with a rage that burned away the last vestiges of filial obedience. His famous confrontation with his father on the eve of João's departure revealed how completely Pedro's loyalties had shifted. When the king ordered him to prepare for eventual recall to Portugal, Pedro's response was swift and uncompromising. If Portugal tries to reduce us to our former colonial status, we'll make ourselves independent. The words hung in the air between father and son like an unsheathed sword, marking the moment when family duty finally surrendered to political conviction. As João Vi's ships disappeared over the horizon in April 1821, Pedro stood on the balcony of the Paco Imperial and surveyed a city that had become more than his home. It had become his destiny. The boy who had arrived as a refugee 13 years earlier was now a man whose every instinct tied him to Brazilian soil. The Portuguese officials who remained in Rio watched him nervously, sensing that they were no longer dealing with a compliant colonial administrator, but with something far more dangerous. A prince who had chosen his people over his birthright. The letters that began arriving from Lisbon throughout 1821 confirmed Pedro's worst fears about Portuguese intentions. The revolutionary government demanded not just his return, but the systematic dismantling of everything that had made Brazil a worthy stage for royal ambitions. They wanted to close Brazilian universities, restrict trade, reduce the colonial military, and transform Rio from an imperial capital back into a provincial port. Each demand strengthened Pedro's resolve to resist, even as it narrowed his options for peaceful compromise. By the end of 1821, the stage was set for the drama that would unfold at Ipiranga. Pedro had chosen Brazil over Portugal, constitutional monarchy over absolutism, and the uncertain promise of independence over the comfortable certainties of colonial rule. The fuse that had been lit in the confrontations with his mother, that had smoldered through his political awakening, and that had been fanned by Portuguese intransigence, was now burning toward an explosion that would reshape the map of South America. The only question remaining was not whether Pedro would choose independence, but how dramatically he would announce his decision to the world. The letters from Lisbon arrived with the regularity of death sentences throughout the first half of 1821, each one tightening the noose around Pedro's throat with surgical precision. The Portuguese Cortes, that revolutionary parliament born from liberal dreams and commercial desperation, had crafted demands that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what Brazil had become during 13 years of royal residence. They wanted their prince back, but more than that, they wanted to turn back time itself, to restore the comfortable colonial relationship where Portugal commanded and Brazil obeyed. The most humiliating demand came in August. Pedro must return to Europe immediately for his political education. The language dripped with condescension, as if the man who had governed Brazil as regent, who had navigated the complex politics of a continental empire, who had won the loyalty of millions through his embrace of their culture, needed schooling in the art of governance from men who had never ventured beyond the Tagus River. The Cortes promised to send him on a grand tour of European capitals, studying constitutional monarchy under the tutelage of foreign courts before returning to assume some lesser role in the Portuguese hierarchy. To Pedro, this educational journey represented nothing less than political castration. He understood that once he left Brazilian soil, he would never return as anything more than a ceremonial figurehead. The men who had seized power in Lisbon intended to break the emotional and political bonds that tied him to Brazil, to transform him back into a compliant European prince who would serve Portuguese commercial interests without question. They offered him a crown in exchange for his soul, and the bargain filled him with a rage that burned like tropical fever. The Brazilian response to news of Pedro's potential departure revealed how completely the political landscape had shifted during the years of royal exile. What had begun as scattered grumbling among merchants and planters crystallized into organized resistance that crossed class and racial lines with unprecedented unity. In Rio's streets, free blacks and Portuguese immigrants found themselves chanting the same slogans. In plantation houses, sugar barons who normally viewed each other as rivals began coordinating their opposition to Portuguese demands. Even the clergy, traditionally the most conservative element in colonial society, began preaching sermons that emphasized Brazil's divine destiny as an independent nation. The word that captured this revolutionary moment was simple yet profound. Fico, I will stay. It began as a whispered hope in Rio's coffee houses, but spread like wildfire through every level of Brazilian society. Market vendors embroidered it on their aprons, students carved it into university walls, and society ladies worked it into their needlepoint. More than a slogan, Fico became a prayer, a battle cry, a declaration of national identity that transcended the old colonial categories of Portuguese and Brazilian, master and slave, European and American. The morning of January 9th, 1822, dawned with a kind of crystalline clarity that Rio's residents recognized as nature's preparation for drama. The air carried none of the usual tropical humidity, and even the harbor's omnipresent breeze seemed to hold its breath, as if the city itself sensed that history was about to pivot on the decisions of a single man. Pedro had spent the night in sleepless agitation, pacing the Paco Imperial's corridors while conflicting advisors whispered urgent counsel in his ears. José Bonifacio, the mineralogist turned revolutionary whom Pedro had appointed as his chief minister, presented the case for defiance with the methodical precision of a scientist laying out experimental results. Independence, he argued, wasn't just politically necessary, but economically inevitable. Brazil's wealth now exceeded Portugal's. Its population had grown beyond metropolitan control, and its strategic importance to European powers meant that independence would bring immediate international recognition. To submit to Portuguese demands would be to surrender Brazil's natural destiny for the sake of sentimental attachment to a motherland that no longer deserved the name. On the other side stood the Portuguese faction, led by men whose fortunes and families remained tied to European soil. They painted terrifying pictures of what defiance might bring: economic blockade, military invasion, diplomatic isolation, and civil war between Portuguese loyalists and Brazilian patriots. These weren't idle threats. Portugal still maintained significant military forces in Brazilian ports, and the Royal Navy that had protected the fleeing court in 1807 might easily become the instrument of its return to colonial subjugation. The decisive moment came when a crowd began gathering in the Paco Imperial's courtyard, their voices rising in that now familiar chant. Fico! 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 Pedro appeared on the palace balcony and saw below him a sea of faces that represented every element of Brazilian society. Portuguese merchants stood beside African freedmen. Jesuit priests linked arms with revolutionary students, and plantation wives raised their parasols in solidarity with dock workers' daughters. This wasn't a mob but a nation, and they were looking to him for leadership. Pedro's response to the crowd became the stuff of legend, though like most legendary moments, The exact words varied depending on who told the story. What remained consistent was the emotional power of his declaration. "Tell the people that I will stay." The crowd erupted in celebration that could be heard across Guanabara Bay, their cheers echoing off the mountains that surrounded Rio like a bowl designed to amplify the birth cries of nations. But Pedro's private moment of decision came after the crowd dispersed, when he sat alone in his study composing the letter that would inform Lisbon of his choice. His hand trembled as he wrote the words that would make him either a founding father or a condemned traitor. "The happiness of Brazil, the common good of the people, and my own honor demand that I remain." When he signed his name to this document, Pedro de Alcântara transformed from Portuguese prince to Brazilian revolutionary, crossing a line that no amount of subsequent regret could uncross. The months following the FICO Declaration witnessed Brazil's transformation from restive colony to nascent nation-state with breathtaking speed. Pedro's decision to defy Portuguese authority had unleashed forces that even he couldn't fully control, as regional leaders throughout the vast territory began declaring their independence from Lisbon and their loyalty to the Brazilian cause. The unity that had seemed impossible given Brazil's size and diversity suddenly emerged as different regions recognized their shared interest in preventing a return to colonial subordination. The challenge Pedro faced was monumental, creating the institutions of independent government while simultaneously preparing for the war that Portuguese intransigence made inevitable. He needed to raise armies from a population with no tradition of military service, finance operations from a treasury drained by years of supporting the exiled court, and maintain diplomatic relations with European powers who viewed independence movements with deep suspicion following the Napoleonic chaos. José Bonifacio proved invaluable during this organizational period. His European education and scientific methodology providing the intellectual framework for state building on an unprecedented scale. Together, Pedro and his chief minister created a constitutional monarchy that balanced popular representation with executive authority, established a national army that incorporated both Portuguese loyalists and Brazilian patriots, and opened diplomatic channels with Britain and other powers whose recognition would legitimize their revolutionary government. The most delicate aspect of this state-building process involved the question of slavery, the institution that underpinned Brazil's economy but contradicted the liberal principles that justified independence. Pedro's solution was characteristically pragmatic and morally ambiguous. He would maintain slavery for the present while promising gradual emancipation in the future. This compromise satisfied neither abolitionists nor slaveholders completely, but it prevented the kind of social revolution that had torn apart Haiti and frightened property owners throughout the Americas. Pedro's personal life during this period reflected the larger tensions racking Brazilian society. His marriage to Archduchess Leopoldina of Austria had been arranged to strengthen ties with European powers, but his heart belonged to Domitila de Castro, the passionate Brazilian woman who understood his adopted country in ways his Habsburg wife never could. This romantic triangle would later explode into scandal, but during the independence struggle, it symbolized Pedro's own divided loyalties between European respectability and Brazilian authenticity. The military preparations for independence revealed both Pedro's strengths and weaknesses as a leader. His personal courage was unquestionable. He led from the front in every engagement, sharing the dangers faced by common soldiers and inspiring loyalty through example rather than mere authority. However, his temper and impatience sometimes led to strategic mistakes that more experienced commanders might have avoided. The combination of bravery and recklessness that made him a charismatic revolutionary would later prove problematic as a ruling monarch. The events of September 7, 1822, began not with dramatic flourishes, but with the mundane discomforts that attend most historical turning points. Pedro had ridden out from Sao Paulo that morning suffering from a severe case of dysentery that left him weak, feverish, and barely able to stay in his saddle. The irony was bitter. The man who would declare Brazilian independence was quite literally bleeding from internal wounds. His body racked with the same tropical diseases that had claimed so many European colonizers before him. The letters that caught up with him near the Ipiranga River contained news that transformed physical suffering into transcendent rage. The Portuguese Cortes had voted to revoke every measure that recognized Brazilian autonomy, to recall all Brazilian-born officials from positions of authority, and to reduce Pedro's own status to that of a mere governor subject to direct supervision from Lisbon. More insulting still, they had voted to prosecute him for treason if he continued to resist their authority, treating the prince who had defied them as a common criminal deserving of punishment. José Bonifacio's accompanying letter made clear that the time for compromise had passed forever. Portuguese military commanders in Brazil had received orders to arrest Pedro if necessary, and ships carrying reinforcements were already en route from Europe. The choice was stark: submit to humiliation and probable imprisonment, or declare independence and face the consequences of open rebellion against legitimate authority. The physical setting for Pedro's decision possessed a symbolic power that would resonate through generations of Brazilian patriots. The Ipiranga River, small and unassuming, represented the countless waterways that drain Brazil's vast interior toward the Atlantic. The surrounding hills, covered in the lush vegetation that marked the transition between coast and plateau, embodied the geographical diversity that made Brazil more continent than country. Standing in this landscape, Pedro could see both the challenge and the promise of the nation he was being asked to create. The moment of decision came with characteristic suddenness. Pedro's rage, building throughout the morning as fever and political fury reinforced each other, exploded in a gesture that would be frozen in bronze and marble for centuries to come. He tore the Portuguese insignia from his uniform with such violence that fabric ripped and buttons scattered in the dust. Drawing his sword toward the sky, he screamed words that echoed across the hills like thunder. Independence or death. The psychological impact of this moment on Pedro himself was as profound as its political consequences for Brazil. By destroying the symbols that connected him to Portuguese authority, he was performing a ritual of self-transformation that converted Prince Pedro of Braganza into Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. The sword that gleamed in the afternoon sun was no longer the weapon of a rebellious colonial administrator, but the symbol of sovereignty for a nation that had declared its right to exist. The declaration at Ipiranga marked the beginning rather than the end of Brazilian independence. For Pedro's dramatic gesture would mean nothing unless he could transform revolutionary theater into political reality. The months following September 7th witnessed a desperate race against time as the new emperor, a title he would not officially claim until December. sought to consolidate his authority before Portuguese reinforcements could arrive to crush the independence movement in its infancy. The response to news of independence revealed the complex loyalties that divided Brazilian society along lines that didn't always correspond to birth or economic interest. In Rio, the celebration was immediate and overwhelming, with crowds filling the streets in demonstrations that lasted for days. But in Salvador de Bahia, Portuguese merchants and military commanders organized fierce resistance that would require months of brutal fighting to overcome. In the Amazon, loyalty to Portugal remained strong among populations who saw little connection between their daily lives and the political struggles centered in the south. Pedro's genius during this period lay in his ability to present independence not as radical revolution, but as conservative defense of established order. Rather than calling for the destruction of existing institutions, he promised to preserve them under Brazilian rather than Portuguese authority. Property rights would be respected. The Catholic Church would maintain its privileged position, and social hierarchies would remain intact. This reassured conservative elements who might otherwise have opposed independence out of fear that political revolution would lead to social chaos. The international dimension of Brazilian independence proved equally complex, as European powers struggled to balance their sympathy for legitimate monarchy against their fear of revolutionary contagion. Britain's decision to recognize Brazilian independence came only after careful calculation of commercial advantages. While the Holy Alliance powers remained suspicious of any movement that challenged established authority. Pedro's Habsburg marriage proved invaluable in this diplomatic chess game, as Austria's reluctance to condemn its own archduchess's husband provided cover for other powers to accept the fait accompli of Brazilian sovereignty. The personal cost of independence for Pedro became apparent in his final correspondence with his father, King João VI. The letters between father and son during this period reveal the anguish of men who loved each other despite finding themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable political divide. João's reproaches carried the weight of paternal disappointment, while Pedro's responses mixed filial affection with unyielding determination to pursue what he saw as Brazil's destiny. The tragedy of their relationship was that both men were right according to their own perspectives. João in defending the unity of the Portuguese Empire, Pedro in championing the rights of his adopted homeland. As 1822 drew to a close, Pedro faced the ultimate irony of his revolutionary career. Having destroyed one crown to save a nation, he now had to create another crown to rule it. The boy who had fled Portugal as a refugee prince was about to become Brazil's first emperor, wielding authority that would make him one of the most powerful monarchs in the Americas. Yet this triumph carried within it the seeds of future tragedy. For the same passionate nature that had driven him to choose independence over obedience would eventually make him unsuitable for the patient compromises that successful governance required. The coronation schedule for December 1st would transform Pedro from revolutionary leader into constitutional monarch. But it could not resolve the fundamental contradictions that independence had created rather than solved. How could a nation founded on the principle of liberty continue to enslave millions of its people? How could a constitutional monarchy preserve order in a territory larger than Europe itself? How could a man who had proven his love for Brazil through sacrifice and struggle learn to govern it through law rather than passion? These questions would define Pedro's reign and ultimately destroy it. But in the golden summer of independence, they seemed like problems that success could solve. The emperor-elect who rode back toward Rio in December 1822 carried with him not just the title of liberator, but the terrible burden of creating a nation worthy of the sacrifices that had brought it into being. The sword he had drawn at Ipiranga would soon be exchanged for a crown of thorns, and the cheers that had greeted his declaration of independence would eventually turn to curses that would drive him into exile. But that tragedy lay in the future. For now, Brazil was free, and Pedro was its hero. The crown that descended upon Pedro's head in Rio's cathedral on December 1st, 1822, carried within its golden circlet the accumulated weight of continental ambition and impossible expectations. At 24, the young emperor found himself ruler of a territory larger than Europe, populated by nearly 4 million souls whose loyalties remained as fragmented as the geography that separated them. The same passionate nature that had driven him to declare independence at Ipiranga now faced the grinding demands of governance, where theatrical gestures meant nothing and patient compromise meant everything. The coronation ceremony itself revealed the precarious foundations upon which Brazilian independence rested. While crowds cheered in Rio's streets, Portuguese forces still controlled key provinces, and the very gold that adorned Pedro's crown had been borrowed against future revenues that might never materialize if the new nation collapsed into civil war. The European diplomats who attended the ceremony did so with carefully calculated protocol, present enough to avoid offense, but distant enough to preserve their options should Portuguese forces succeed in reconquering their former colony. Pedro's first challenge as emperor was not external invasion, but internal fragmentation. The regional strongmen who had supported independence had done so primarily to escape Portuguese control, not to submit to a new Brazilian autocracy based in Rio. In the Northeast, Republican sentiments ran strong among merchants and planters who viewed monarchy as an outdated European import. In the South, Gaucho leaders who had carved their own domains from the endless grasslands saw little reason to bow before a crown worn by a man they considered barely Brazilian himself. The constitution that Pedro promulgated in 1824 attempted to balance these competing forces through a system that borrowed from both British parliamentary tradition and French imperial precedent. The emperor retained significant executive powers, including the controversial moderating power that allowed him to dissolve parliament and intervene in judicial proceedings. Yet this same document guaranteed individual liberties and provincial representation that went far beyond anything Portugal had ever offered its colonies. The tension between these democratic promises and autocratic realities would poison Pedro's reign from its very beginning. While Pedro struggled with the theatrical demands of imperial ceremony, it was his Habsburg wife who provided the administrative competence that kept the new empire from collapsing into chaos. Archduchess Leopoldina had arrived in Brazil as a political bride. Her marriage arranged to cement European recognition of Portuguese legitimacy. Instead, she became the intellectual architect of Brazilian independence. Her letters to European courts providing the diplomatic foundation that transformed colonial rebellion into recognized sovereignty. Leopoldina's influence on Pedro during the independence struggle cannot be overstated. where the emperor's temperament inclined toward dramatic gesture and immediate action. His wife provided the methodical planning and careful calculation that successful revolution required. She maintained correspondence with European naturalists and philosophers, creating a network of intellectual allies who presented Brazilian independence to European public opinion as the natural evolution of enlightened governance rather than dangerous revolutionary precedent. The irony of their partnership was that Leopoldina understood Brazil more deeply than her Brazilian-born husband in many crucial respects. Her correspondence with natural scientists had given her an intimate knowledge of the country's geography, resources, and potential that Pedro's emotional attachment could never match. While he saw Brazil through the lens of personal loyalty and romantic attachment, she viewed it with the analytical precision of someone who recognized its historical significance as humanity's greatest experiment in continental governance. During Pedro's frequent absences to suppress regional rebellions, Leopoldina effectively ruled Brazil from Rio, demonstrating an administrative competence that impressed even Pedro's political enemies. She understood that the new empire's survival depended not on grand gestures, but on the mundane work of building functional institutions, collecting taxes, maintaining roads, administering justice, and preserving order across distances that strained the limits of 19th century communication. Her quiet efficiency provided the stability that allowed Pedro's more dramatic leadership to capture public imagination without destroying public order. Yet even as Leopoldina anchored the empire through her competence, she suffered from the same isolation that afflicted all European brides in the Americas. Her letters home revealed the deep loneliness of a woman whose intellectual gifts were rarely appreciated in a society that valued feminine ornament over feminine intelligence. The tropical climate that enervated her European constitution became a metaphor for the broader incompatibility between her Habsburg restraint and Brazilian passion that would ultimately destroy her marriage and her life. The woman who would destroy Pedro's marriage and reputation appeared in his life with the inevitability of tropical fever, her arrival marking the moment when private passion began to overwhelm public duty. Domitila de Castro Canto e Melo possessed everything that Leopoldina lacked. The fierce sensuality that matched Pedro's own temperament, the intuitive understanding of Brazilian society that came from native birth, and the emotional intensity that made political calculations seem pale and bloodless by comparison. Their affair began during one of Pedro's tours of São Paulo province, where Domitila's husband served as a minor colonial official whose loyalty to the crown came at the price of his wife's virtue. The attraction between emperor and aristocrat was immediate and overwhelming, a collision of personalities that generated the kind of destructive energy that observers could sense across crowded rooms. Pedro, who had spent his adult life performing the role of constitutional monarch, found in Domitila someone who demanded nothing but authenticity, who cared nothing for protocol and everything for passion. The transformation of imperial mistress into political institution began when Pedro created Domitila as Marchioness of Santos, elevating her from provincial aristocrat to imperial favorite with ceremonial recognition that scandalized even the relatively tolerant standards of Brazilian court society. This wasn't merely adultery, but something approaching bigamy, as Pedro began to treat Domitila as his true wife, while reducing Leopoldina to the status of ceremonial consort whose primary function was producing legitimate heirs. The political consequences of Pedro's infatuation extended far beyond personal scandal into the realm of constitutional crisis. Brazilian independence had been justified through appeals to moral superiority over Portuguese corruption and Habsburg legitimacy over Republican chaos. When the emperor began flaunting his mistress at official ceremonies while his legitimate wife withdrew into humiliated isolation, he undermined the very foundations of his own authority. Opposition newspapers that had been forced to attack Pedro's policies in abstract terms now had concrete evidence of moral unfitness that resonated with ordinary citizens who might not understand constitutional theory, but certainly recognized marital betrayal. The arrival of Domitilla's relatives at court completed the transformation of personal indiscretion into institutional corruption. Pedro appointed her brothers to lucrative government positions, granted her family extensive land concessions, and allowed her to influence appointments throughout the imperial bureaucracy. What had begun as passionate romance had degenerated into the kind of nepotistic favoritism that colonial reformers had identified as the fundamental weakness of Portuguese administration. The emperor who had proclaimed Brazil's moral superiority was recreating the very vices that had justified independence in the first place. The slow destruction of Leopoldina's health and happiness during the years of Pedro's obsession with Domitilla represented more than personal tragedy. It became a metaphor for the broader failure of constitutional monarchy to fulfill the promises of independence. The woman who had sacrificed her European identity to become Brazilian, who had provided the intellectual foundation for independence, who had governed competently during Pedro's absences, found herself reduced to the status of unwanted ornament in her own palace. Leopoldina's letters during this period reveal the psychological torture of a woman whose public dignity depended upon pretending not to notice what everyone around her could see plainly. Imperial protocol demanded that she receive Domitilla at court functions, smile graciously while her husband's mistress wore jewelry that had been purchased with imperial funds, and maintain the fiction that her marriage remained intact while Pedro spent his nights in the Marchioness's apartments. The strain of this performance, combined with the tropical diseases that constantly weakened her European constitution, began to destroy her health with systematic efficiency. The birth of Leopoldina's final child in 1826 occurred under circumstances that would fuel conspiracy theories for generations. Pedro's public indifference to his wife's pregnancy, his refusal to moderate his behavior with Domitilla even during the Empress's confinement, and his apparent relief when the child died shortly after birth suggested to many observers that he viewed his legitimate family as an obstacle to his true happiness. When Leopoldina herself died just months later, at the age of 29, rumors immediately began circulating that Pedro had hastened her death through physical violence or deliberate neglect. The truth of what transpired between Pedro and Leopoldina during her final weeks remains buried beneath layers of imperial censorship and partisan interpretation. What cannot be disputed is that her death marked the moment when Pedro's personal failures began to undermine his political authority beyond any possibility of recovery. The empress who had embodied the European respectability that legitimized Brazilian independence had been destroyed by the very man who owed his crown to her sacrifice, and Brazilian public opinion began to turn against an emperor whose private vices seemed to mirror the public corruption that had justified rebellion against Portugal. The symbolic power of Leopoldina's death was amplified by the contrast between her dignified suffering and Domitilla's triumphant display. While the empress lay dying, attended only by her loyal servants and ignored by her husband, the Marchioness continued to appear at court functions wearing increasingly elaborate costumes that seemed designed to celebrate her victory over legitimate authority. This grotesque juxtaposition between virtue suffering and vice triumphant provided Pedro's political enemies with propaganda more powerful than any constitutional argument they might have devised. The riots that erupted across Brazil following news of Leopoldina's death marked the beginning of Pedro's transformation from beloved liberator to despised tyrant in the public imagination. The crowds that had once chanted Fico now screamed curses at the emperor, whose personal conduct had betrayed their trust in his moral authority. The same emotional intensity that had made Pedro an effective revolutionary leader now worked against him, as his inability to moderate his passion for Domitilla convinced ordinary Brazilians that their emperor placed personal gratification above national duty. The economic crisis that coincided with Pedro's marital scandal deepened public resentment by providing concrete evidence that imperial incompetence extended beyond bedroom farce into matters of life and death for ordinary citizens. The wars of independence had drained the imperial treasury, but Pedro's extravagant spending on court ceremonies and gifts for Domitilla's family convinced taxpayers that their sacrifices were being squandered on imperial luxury rather than invested in national development. The inflation that ravaged urban workers' wages during this period became linked in popular imagination to Pedro's personal excess, creating a narrative of imperial selfishness that opposition journalists exploited with devastating effectiveness. The military crisis that developed simultaneously with these domestic troubles revealed how completely Pedro had misunderstood the sources of his own authority. The emperor, who had once led charges against Portuguese forces, now found himself commanding troops whose loyalty depended more on regular pay than romantic attachment to his person. When economic crisis forced delays in military salaries, the same officers who had risked their lives for independence began to question whether Pedro's continued rule served Brazilian interests or merely imperial vanity. The Cisplatin War, Pedro's disastrous attempt to maintain Brazilian control over what would become Uruguay, provided the final evidence that imperial ambition had overwhelmed imperial competence. The enormous expense of this conflict, combined with its ultimate failure to achieve any meaningful strategic objectives, convinced even Pedro's remaining supporters that his judgment had been fatally compromised by personal obsessions. Military officers who had expected to serve a Brazilian Napoleon found themselves following a Brazilian Don Quixote, tilting at windmills while their empire crumbled around them. The provincial rebellions that erupted throughout Brazil during Pedro's final years as emperor reflected not merely political opposition, but the deeper cultural rejection of a monarch who had violated the moral foundations of his own authority. The regional strongmen who had initially supported independence because it freed them from Portuguese control now viewed Pedro's centralized monarchy as simply another form of foreign domination, imposed by a ruler whose European blood and imperial pretensions made him fundamentally alien to Brazilian aspirations. By 1829, The emperor who had once embodied Brazilian hopes for independence found himself trapped in a palace that had become a prison of his own making. The love affair with Domitila that had cost him his marriage, his reputation, and his political authority continued to dominate his emotional life, even as it destroyed his capacity to govern effectively. The passionate nature that had driven him to choose Brazil over Portugal now enslaved him to a woman whose very presence reminded his subjects of imperial failure and moral bankruptcy. The irony of Pedro's situation was that his personal happiness coincided perfectly with his political destruction. The same intensity of feeling that made him an inadequate constitutional monarch made him a devoted lover, whose every gesture toward Domitila further alienated the Brazilian people who had once worshipped him as their liberator. He faced the terrible choice between personal fulfillment and political survival, and his temperament made compromise impossible. He would love completely or not at all, regardless of the consequences for his empire. The signs of imperial collapse multiplied with each passing month, as Pedro's authority evaporated like morning mist before the tropical sun. Military officers who had once competed for the honor of serving under his command now openly discussed the possibility of republican government. Provincial assemblies that had initially celebrated imperial protection from Portuguese control began asserting their independence from Rio's authority. Even the urban crowds that had provided the emotional foundation for Pedro's revolutionary leadership turned their passionate intensity against the man who had disappointed their faith in his moral leadership. The gathering storm of 1830 would soon break over Pedro's head with the fury of a tropical hurricane, sweeping away not just his throne, but his identity as a Brazilian. The emperor who had chosen his adopted country over his birth nation would soon face exile from both, carrying with him only the bitter knowledge that passionate love and political wisdom rarely coincided in the same heart. The crown that had seemed so glorious at Ipiranga was becoming too heavy for any mortal head to bear. And Pedro would soon discover that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go. The night of March 13th, 1831, found Pedro alone in his study at the São Cristóvão Palace, staring at reports that read like a catalog of imperial collapse. The same passionate crowds that had once chanted his name now filled Rio's streets demanding his abdication. Their revolutionary fervor turned against the man who had taught them to defy authority in the first place. The emperor who had once embodied the spirit of Brazilian independence now found himself cast as the foreign tyrant from whom Brazil needed liberating. The ultimate irony for a man who had sacrificed everything for his adopted homeland. The immediate catalyst for this final crisis was Pedro's decision to appoint a new ministry composed entirely of Portuguese-born officials, a move that his enemies seized upon as proof that the emperor had never truly embraced Brazilian identity. The deeper cause, however, lay in the accumulated resentments of 9 years of imperial rule marked by economic crisis, military failure, and personal scandal. The Domitila affair had provided the emotional framework for opposition, but the structural problems of governing a continental empire with insufficient resources would have challenged even a perfectly virtuous monarch. The military abandonment that sealed Pedro's fate began with the very regiment that had proclaimed him emperor in 1822. The 1st Regiment of Artillery, whose officers had once competed for the honor of serving under Pedro's direct command, now posted guards around their barracks to prevent the emperor from entering what had once been his sanctuary. The symbolism was devastating. The institution that had created his authority now rejected it. And without military support, no crown could survive the democratic fury that independence had unleashed. The economic dimensions of Pedro's downfall reflected the impossible contradictions built into Brazilian independence itself. The new nation had inherited all the expenses of governing a continental territory, while losing access to the Portuguese commercial network that had financed colonial administration. Pedro's government had borrowed heavily from British banks to fund everything from military campaigns to court ceremonies, creating a debt burden that consumed nearly half of all imperial revenues. When opposition newspapers published these figures alongside accounts of imperial extravagance, they created a narrative of financial irresponsibility that resonated with taxpayers struggling through economic depression. The provincial rebellions that erupted simultaneously across Brazil during Pedro's final months revealed how completely the federal compact of independence had dissolved. In Pernambuco, Republican leaders proclaimed their intention to govern without imperial interference, while in Rio Grande do Sul, separatist movements began organizing what would become a decade-long revolt against central authority. The empire that Pedro had created to preserve Brazilian unity was fragmenting into the very regionalism that independence had been designed to prevent. The dawn of April 7, 1831, brought Pedro face to face with a choice that had been building inevitably since the first riots began 3 weeks earlier. He could fight to preserve his throne through military force, potentially triggering a civil war that would destroy the very nation he had created. Or he could surrender his crown and trust that his abdication would preserve Brazilian unity under his 5-year-old son's regency. The decision revealed both Pedro's greatest strength and his fundamental limitation. He loved Brazil too much to destroy it for the sake of his own ambition, but he lacked the patient political skills that might have preserved both crown and country. The scene in the palace throne room as Pedro prepared his abdication decree captured the tragic dimensions of his imperial career. Surrounded by the few courtiers who remained loyal, he dictated words that transformed him from emperor to exile with a stroke of his pen. Using the right which the Constitution grants me, I declare that I have voluntarily abdicated the crown in favor of my beloved and esteemed son Dom Pedro de Alcântara. The constitutional language masked the emotional devastation of a man who was surrendering not just political power, but his identity as a Brazilian. The most poignant moment of the abdication ceremony came when Pedro knelt before his son's miniature throne to place the imperial crown on a head too small to bear its weight. The 5-year-old Pedro, too, dressed in ceremonial robes that pooled around his feet like golden water, could not possibly understand the magnitude of what was happening. But his father's whispered words would echo through Brazilian history. "Wear it better than I did, my son. Love this country as I have loved it, but govern it as I could not." The crown that had blazed with promise at Ipiranga now seemed too heavy for mortal shoulders, requiring the innocence of childhood to restore its luster. The international dimension of Pedro's abdication reflected the broader failure of his attempt to balance Brazilian nationalism with European legitimacy. The diplomatic representatives who had attended his coronation 9 years earlier now watched his downfall with the calculating interest of powers who viewed Latin American independence as a temporary aberration that time and European intervention would eventually correct. Pedro's defeat seemed to validate conservative predictions that constitutional monarchy could not survive in the tropical chaos of the New World, where passion overwhelmed reason and democracy degenerated into mob rule. The personal cost of abdication for Pedro transcended mere loss of political power to encompass the destruction of everything that had given his life meaning since 1822. He was losing not just his throne but his country, not just his authority but his identity, not just his present but his future. The man who had once commanded continental loyalty now faced exile as complete as death itself, carrying with him only the bitter knowledge that love alone was insufficient to overcome the structural impossibilities of governing a nation too vast for any single will to comprehend. The ship that carried Pedro away from Brazilian shores in April 1830 bore a cargo more precious than gold. The broken dreams of continental unity and the shattered heart of a man who had sacrificed everything for an adopted homeland that no longer wanted him. The Atlantic crossing that had once brought him to his destiny now carried him toward an uncertain future in a Europe that remembered him only as the Portuguese prince who had betrayed his heritage for American ambitions. The irony was complete. The man who had chosen Brazil over Portugal now found himself unwelcome in both countries. A political exile whose very existence reminded others of the dangerous power of passionate conviction. Pedro's arrival in Europe revealed the extent to which his Brazilian adventure had transformed him from European prince into something unprecedented in the monarchical tradition. His mannerisms, his speech patterns, even his physical gestures carried the marks of tropical experience that made him seem foreign to the courts that had once embraced him as family. The Habsburg relatives who received him at various European capitals treated him with the careful courtesy reserved for dangerous relatives whose political failures might prove contagious if not carefully contained. The news that reached Pedro in 1832 provided him with the opportunity for redemption that his restless nature desperately craved. His brother Miguel had usurped the Portuguese throne that rightfully belonged to Pedro's daughter Maria, creating a constitutional crisis that threatened to plunge the Iberian Peninsula into civil war. For Pedro, this crisis represented more than family politics. It offered the chance to redeem his reputation as a defender of constitutional monarchy and legitimate succession, the very principles he had failed to uphold successfully in Brazil. The transformation of the failed Brazilian emperor into a Portuguese constitutionalist general revealed the extent to which exile had clarified Pedro's understanding of his own nature. He was not, he realized, suited for the patient compromises and careful calculations that successful monarchy required. His talents lay in the dramatic moments of crisis, when passionate leadership could inspire ordinary people to extraordinary sacrifice. The tuberculosis that was already beginning to consume his lungs seemed almost appropriate. He was burning himself out in service to causes that required the total expenditure of physical and emotional energy. The military campaigns that Pedro organized to restore his daughter's throne demonstrated that exile had taught him lessons about leadership that imperial power had obscured. Leading armies composed of Portuguese exiles, British volunteers, and French adventurers, he showed a tactical flexibility and personal courage that reminded observers of the young prince who had declared independence at Ipiranga. The difference was that he now understood the cost of his passionate nature and accepted it as the price of remaining true to his fundamental convictions about justice and legitimate authority. The battlefields of northern Portugal during 1833 and 1834 witnessed the final flowering of Pedro's military genius. As the former Brazilian emperor led republican and constitutional forces against his brother's absolutist army, with the desperate energy of a man fighting for his historical legacy as much as his daughter's throne. The trenches around Porto, where Pedro established his headquarters, became the laboratory where he refined the leadership techniques that Brazilian independence had taught him, adapting the lessons of continental warfare to the intimate geography of European civil conflict. The physical toll of the Portuguese campaign revealed the extent to which Pedro's Brazilian ordeal had damaged both his health and his constitution. The tuberculosis that had begun as a minor respiratory ailment during his final years in Rio now dominated his daily existence, each coughing fit spraying blood that reminded him of his mortality's approach. Yet this awareness of impending death seemed to liberate rather than constrain him, freeing him from the careful calculations that had paralyzed his Brazilian reign, and allowing him to embrace the romantic gesture that had always been his natural métier. The soldiers who served under Pedro during the Portuguese Civil War left accounts that captured both his tactical brilliance and his physical deterioration during the campaign's final months. He would arrive at dawn planning sessions already exhausted from night-long coughing fits, but his strategic insights remained as sharp as ever, and his personal courage in leading charges inspired devotion among troops who had initially questioned his commitment to their cause. The man who had failed as a constitutional monarch discovered his true calling as a revolutionary general, leading from the front with a kind of passionate intensity that made ordinary soldiers willing to die for causes they barely understood. The irony of Pedro's Portuguese campaign was that he achieved his greatest military success while dying from the diseases that Brazilian climate had fostered in his European constitution. Each victory over Miguel's forces came at the cost of further physical decline, as if Pedro was literally burning his life force to fuel the energy required for leadership in impossible circumstances. His correspondence during this period reveals a man who understood that he was trading his remaining years for the chance to restore legitimate monarchy in Portugal. A bargain he accepted with the fatalistic resignation of someone who had already lost everything that mattered most. The decisive Battle of Assaicira in May 1834 marked both the climax of Pedro's military career and the beginning of his final decline. Leading a cavalry charge despite a fever that left him barely able to stay in his saddle, he broke Miguel's last organized resistance and secured his daughter's throne through personal valor that recalled the legendary heroes of medieval romance. The victory that restored constitutional monarchy to Portugal cost Pedro the last reserves of strength that had sustained him through 2 years of exile and warfare, leaving him a physical wreck who had nonetheless achieved the redemption that had eluded him in Brazil. The consumptive fever that claimed Pedro's life in September 1834 consumed him with the same intensity that had marked every passion of his brief but tumultuous career. Confined to his deathbed in the Queluz Palace where he had spent his childhood, the former emperor of Brazil and liberator of Portugal faced his final enemy with the same combination of courage and recklessness that had characterized his approach to every other challenge life had presented. The doctors who attended his final illness marveled at the tenacity with which he clung to life. as if his will alone could overcome the physical limitations that disease had imposed upon his wasted frame. The political dimensions of Pedro's deathbed became as complex as everything else in his turbulent life. As representatives of multiple governments competed for the honor of claiming his legacy, the Portuguese constitutionalists who had benefited from his military leadership wanted to present him as a martyr defender of parliamentary monarchy, while Brazilian diplomatic representatives hoped to repair the relationship with their founding emperor that his abdication had severed. The Habsburg family members who gathered around his bedside represented the European legitimacy that Pedro had both embraced and transcended during his American adventure. The famous last words attributed to Pedro, "Plant a magnolia where they'll remember me," captured the romantic sensibility that had driven his entire career, from the declaration at Ipiranga through the trenches of Portuguese Civil War. Whether he actually spoke these exact words matters less than their symbolic appropriateness for a man whose life had been dedicated to the cultivation of memory through dramatic gesture. The magnolia, with its exotic beauty and tropical associations, represented everything that Pedro had tried to transplant from American soil to European consciousness. The dream of a different kind of monarchy that would embody popular will rather than merely commanding popular obedience. The immediate aftermath of Pedro's death revealed the extent to which his life had transcended the normal categories of political success and failure. The news of his passing triggered mourning in both Brazil and Portugal, as if his death allowed people to remember his virtues while forgetting the failures that had made him impossible to live with. The man who had died in exile was remembered as a liberator. The failed emperor was recalled as a founding father, and the passionate lover was transformed into a romantic hero whose very excesses seemed to validate the sincerity of his commitments. The funeral arrangements that followed Pedro's death reflected the international dimensions of his legacy and the impossibility of containing his memory within any single national tradition. His body was interred in Portuguese soil. Wrapped in the Brazilian flag he had torn from his uniform at Ipiranga, while his heart was preserved separately for eventual transport to the country he had loved too much to govern successfully. This physical division of his remains became a metaphor for the man himself, a figure too large for any single country to claim completely, too complex for any simple narrative to capture adequately. The Portugal that Pedro left behind in September 1834 bore little resemblance to the country he had fled as a boy in 1807, just as the Brazil that mourned his passing had evolved beyond anything its first emperor could have imagined during his reign. His death marked the end of the revolutionary generation that had created Latin American independence, but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of legacy, one that would be measured not in political success, but in the example of passionate commitment to principle that transcended the ordinary calculations of dynastic ambition. The 5-year-old boy who inherited Pedro's Brazilian crown carried within his innocent features the promise of redemption that his father's flawed reign had made necessary. Pedro, too, would face the same continental challenges that had overwhelmed his father, but he would approach them with the patient wisdom that only childhood's tragedy could teach. The crown that had been too heavy for passionate shoulders might prove manageable for a ruler who had learned statecraft through suffering rather than triumph, governance through loss rather than victory. The magnolia that Pedro had requested in his final moments would indeed be planted, though not in the soil he might have expected. His memory would take root in the collective imagination of both Brazil and Portugal, growing slowly through decades of historical reflection that would eventually transform the failed emperor into a founding father, the exiled prince into a romantic hero, the dying consumptive into an eternal symbol of the price that passionate conviction demands from those who choose love over prudence, principle over comfort, dramatic gesture over careful calculation. The heart that would eventually rest in Sao Paulo carried within its preserved chambers all the contradictions that had made Pedro both impossible and indispensable to the history of two nations. It beat with the rhythm of someone who had loved too intensely, fought too recklessly, and dreamed too vastly for the constraints that reality imposes upon even the most exceptional lives. Yet in its very excess lay the seed of inspiration that would outlive every practical failure, every political mistake, every personal tragedy that had marked his brief passage through the world. The man was dead, but the legend was just beginning to grow. They buried Pedro I in Portuguese soil on September 24, 1834, wrapping his body in the same Brazilian flag he had torn from his uniform at Ipiranga 12 years earlier. The irony was perfect. The man who had chosen one country over another in life would be claimed by both in death, his very remains becoming symbols of the impossible divisions that had defined his existence. The funeral procession through Lisbon's streets drew crowds who mourned not just a king, but the end of an age when individual passion could reshape the destiny of nations. For decades, Pedro's name became synonymous with treason in the country he had liberated. Brazilian textbooks portrayed him as a Portuguese prince who had abandoned his adoptive homeland when governing became difficult, a foreign usurper whose abdication proved that monarchy itself was incompatible with American liberty. The Republicans who shaped Brazil's early historical narrative needed Pedro to be a failure. His success would have complicated their argument that only native-born leaders could truly serve Brazilian interests. Yet memory, like the magnolia Pedro had requested on his deathbed, grows in unexpected soil. As Brazil prospered under his son's long reign, historians began to reconsider the founding emperor's legacy with the kind of perspective that only temporal distance can provide. The man who had seemed impossibly flawed when judged by the standards of conventional monarchy began to appear remarkably prescient when evaluated by the criteria of romantic nationalism that dominated 19th century consciousness. The physical journey of Pedro's heart from Portuguese grave to Brazilian shrine became a metaphor for this transformation of memory from condemnation to celebration. In 1972, nearly a century and a half after his death, Brazilian authorities arranged for the return of his preserved heart to Sao Paulo, where it now rests in an ornate urn within the monument that marks the spot where independence was declared. The organ that had beaten with such passionate intensity during his brief life became a relic of impossible passion itself, a tangible reminder that love, however destructive, could reshape the world. The 5-year-old boy who inherited his father's crown would prove that tragedy could teach lessons that triumph never could. Pedro too approached the continental challenges that had overwhelmed his father with the patient wisdom of someone who had learned statecraft through loss rather than victory, governance through suffering rather than celebration. Where the first Pedro had ruled through passionate gesture, the second would govern through careful calculation, demonstrating that crowns could indeed be worn with dignity if the head beneath them had been properly prepared by adversity. The Brazil that flourished under Pedro II's 50-year reign became everything his father had dreamed but could never achieve. The constitutional monarchy that had seemed impossible during the turbulent 1820s evolved into a stable system that balanced regional autonomy with national unity, popular representation with executive authority, progressive reform with social stability. The coffee economy that replaced colonial sugar created unprecedented prosperity, while railroad construction and telegraph lines bound the continental territory together in ways that colonial administration had never managed. Most remarkably, Pedro II accomplished what his father's generation had believed impossible: the gradual abolition of slavery without social revolution. The institution that had paralyzed Pedro I's government through its moral contradictions was dismantled piece by piece through legislation that recognized both economic necessity and ethical imperative. The son succeeded where the father had failed, not because he possessed greater moral courage, but because he understood that sustainable change required patience rather than passion, evolution rather than revolution. The international respect that Pedro II commanded throughout his reign reflected the world's recognition that Brazilian monarchy had achieved something unprecedented in the Americas: a stable, progressive government that combined European sophistication with American innovation. The man who had learned statecraft through his father's failures became a model for constitutional monarchy that influenced liberal movements throughout Latin America and Europe, proving that the seeds planted at Ipiranga could indeed grow into something magnificent given proper cultivation. The historical rehabilitation of Pedro I began during the final decades of his son's reign, as Brazilian intellectuals recognized that their nation's founder deserved credit for creating the institutional framework that had made subsequent prosperity possible. The passionate emperor who had seemed so flawed when judged by the standards of conventional monarchy began to appear remarkably modern when evaluated by 20th century criteria that valued authenticity over restraint, emotional honesty over diplomatic calculation. The Republican Revolution that overthrew Pedro II in 1889 paradoxically accelerated the first Pedro's transformation from failed monarch to founding father. The new regime needed historical precedents for its rejection of European authority, and Pedro's Declaration of Independence provided exactly the kind of dramatic gesture that Republican mythology required. The man who had been condemned as a Portuguese usurper was reborn as a Brazilian patriot whose love for his adopted country had overcome the bonds of birth and blood. The centennial celebrations of Brazilian independence in 1922 completed Pedro's metamorphosis from historical failure to national hero. The government that had once erased his memory now erected monuments to his achievement, transforming the site of his declaration into a pilgrimage destination for patriots seeking inspiration from the past. The sword he had drawn toward the sky at Ipiranga became a symbol of Brazilian sovereignty as powerful as any flag or anthem, while his cry of independence or death entered the pantheon of phrases that defined national identity. Modern Brazil's relationship with Pedro I reflects the broader human need to find meaning in contradiction, purpose in failure, redemption in tragedy. The man who had loved too intensely to govern successfully became a symbol of the passionate intensity that Brazilians recognized as fundamental to their national character. His very excesses validated the authenticity of his commitment to Brazilian independence, while his ultimate failure demonstrated that even founding fathers were human beings subject to the same weaknesses that afflicted ordinary mortals. Today, visitors to the Ipiranga Monument encounter Pedro not as history knew him, but as memory has transformed him. A bronze figure frozen in the moment of his greatest triumph, sword raised toward a sky that promises infinite possibility. The man who died in exile has been restored to the landscape he loved most. His image multiplied in countless textbooks, murals, and statues that present him as the embodiment of Brazilian independence, rather than its most problematic protagonist. The heart that rests in its São Paulo urn has become more than a relic. It has become a symbol of the impossible passion that drives individuals to attempt what reason declares impossible. School children who visit the monument learn not about Pedro's failures as a constitutional monarch, but about his success as a founding father. His personal tragedies subsumed into the larger narrative of national creation that every country requires to justify its existence. The question that Pedro's legacy poses: was he hero, tyrant, or simply a man too vast for the constraints that reality imposes upon human ambition? Reflects the broader challenge of historical judgment itself. How do we evaluate lives that transcend the ordinary categories of success and failure? How do we measure the significance of individuals whose greatest achievements emerged from their deepest flaws? How do we balance the competing claims of personal authenticity and public responsibility? Perhaps the answer lies not in resolving these contradictions, but in embracing them as fundamental to the human condition itself. Pedro defied empires, loved violently, and died fighting for principles that meant more to him than life itself. His legacy survives not because he was perfect, but because he was authentically himself in an age that demanded conformity. Passionately committed in a world that counseled moderation, romantically idealistic in circumstances that required pragmatic calculation. The magnolia that Pedro requested in his final moments has indeed been planted, though not in any physical soil. It grows in the collective memory of two nations that claim him as their own, blooms in the imagination of anyone who has ever chosen love over prudence, principle over comfort, the dramatic gesture over the safe choice. History has room for such contradictions because we ourselves are made of them. Creatures of impossible passion trapped in the practical world. Dreamers forced to negotiate with reality. Hearts that beat with rhythms too complex for any simple story to contain. In the end, Pedro's greatest achievement may have been his demonstration that human beings could indeed reshape the world through the sheer force of passionate conviction, even if they destroyed themselves in the process. The sword he drew at Ipiranga still gleams in the Brazilian sun, a reminder that sometimes love, however flawed, however destructive, however impossible, can indeed conquer empires and create nations. The man is gone, but the legend endures, planted like a magnolia in the soil of memory where it will bloom forever. Subscribe and welcome to the Empire.